Good afternoon. Welcome to Detroit Public Library. I'm going to take this off for just a second. I'm Christine Peel. I am the co-chair of the Detroit Public Library's Author Series. Welcome to Detroit Public Library. Today we welcome Peter J. Hammer. He was named the A. Alfred Tallman Endowed Chair at Wayne State University Law School in the fall of 2018. Hammer has taught at Wayne Law since 2003 and is the director of the Damon J. Keefe Center for Civil Rights. The Keefe Center is dedicated to promoting the educational, economic, and political empowerment of underrepresented communities in urban areas and to ensuring that the phrase equal justice under the law applies to all members of society. Hammer was instrumental in editing and compiling Judge Damon J. Keefe's biography, Crusader for Justice, Federal Judge Damon J. Keefe, and that was published in 2013. Today, he is here at Detroit Public Library to discuss his newest book that he co-wrote with Edward James Littlejohn, No Equal Justice, The Legacy of Civil Rights Icon, George W. Crockett, Jr. So let's welcome Peter J. Hammer.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming out on this beautiful day. I'm sure people are out there wandering around outside that got lost on their way here. But I always say the most important people are here. Anybody here have sort of personal recollections of Judge Crockett? And I just love that. So don't be afraid to be sharing, your own reflections, because it's an opportunity for me to kind of learn new things that I didn't know, and to really honor the wisdom that people are carrying with themselves in terms of approaching the judge. But I always like to start with a shout out to Ed Littlejohn. So Ed is one of our emeritus professors at Wayne State Law School. Ed started this project in the early 1990s, right, which was fortuitous because Ed was able to sit down and have extensive interviews with Judge Crockett, as well as Ernie Goodman. You see the sort of connection between Crockett and the Goodmans as we go forward. And when the judge passed, he left Ed a lot of his personal papers. So we had access to a lot of materials that other people did not. Ed will be celebrating his 87th birthday this year. He is safe fighting hurricanes down in Florida, so he's in Sarasota now. But he always sends his regards to the sort of audiences that we speak to. In the quote, and this was really Ed's idea, we had a lot of extensive long quotes from Judge Crockett. We wanted people that read the book to really hear Crockett's voice and get to know Crockett sort of as a person. So I always like to start out with some quotes from the judge himself to give you a feeling for the man, give you a feeling for why he is such an important figure. And this is where the title of the book came from. He said, "There's no equal justice for black people today. There never has been. To our everlasting shame, the quality of justice in America has always been and is now directly related to the color of one's skin as well as the size of one's pocketbook." He says in a different article, "The reasonable doubt that usually interposed to save the life and liberty of a white person charged with a crime seldom has any focus or effect when a colored person is accused of a crime." He says, "Although the Constitution was written 2 centuries ago, it has no life or meaning for black Americans until the people breathe life into it by living it. And that has been the struggle of the 20th century. And then finally he says, I refuse to allow myself to forget the fact that I'm a black judge. Once I do that, I'm lost." And he had this very sort of elaborate theory of the importance of black judges and the belief it was only black judges and other people that had suffered oppression who had the ability to actually reach the full potential of the constitutional guarantees and the legal protections that a lot of white folks take for granted. So sort of grounding ourselves and hearing the judge's voice, having a sense of the man and his accomplishments as we sort of go through and start telling the story of his own life. This is his father-in-law, right? And his father-in-law was actually born enslaved. You sort of see the closeness between Judge Crockett, and sort of skip ahead, who was born in 1909 in Jacksonville, Florida, and the institutions of slavery. Right? If you go back on his father's side, his great-grandfather actually was self-emancipated. Right? And it's interesting when they do the family history, this kind of confusion where they don't tell that story, right, directly. Right? But if you look at the dates and you look at the locations and other stuff, you really see it was a story of self-emancipation, where his great-grandfather left Maryland, where his family was enslaved, into Delaware, which at that point was a free state, And you have these sort of questions, we struggle a little bit in the book, the why questions, right? And the kind of notion, rather than celebrating it, it was a family secret, right? And even a secret that's being preserved up to the present day, right? And the only sort of insight I can think about is that secrets serve purposes, right? So if it was held secret, they were protecting somebody. And at that point, once you have a secret, it's very hard to liberate a secret, right? So this sort of notion it carries forward. But Judge Crockett, who wrote their family history, put right next to it an article about the Underground Railroad through Maryland and how effective the Underground Railroad was. So you have very clear signs in their own telling of their family history about that notion of self-emancipation. But the Crockett side of the family kept going further north, right, from Delaware into New Jersey, and was really trying to focus on better skills, right, better education, and better lives. Right? On his maternal side, his father-in-law, who you see here, was down in Florida and then moved to South Carolina. Right? And his mother died, and she ended up in New Jersey, where the Crockett family was. Right? So sort of George Crockett Sr. And Minnie meet in New Jersey, right? But then she goes back to South Carolina. Right? And George Sr. tells of his father-in-law that he wants to marry her, and he says, "Well, that's fine, young man. When you're ready, come down to South Carolina." So sort of the love story component following his heart, he leaves that kind of Crockett trajectory, which is going north after emancipation, and goes down to South Carolina to get married, right? Then ends up in Waldo, Florida, which is a fairly rural setting. And George Sr. trying to scratch his head and says, this is too far south. So they ended up moving into Jacksonville, Florida. Right? So George Crockett Jr. was born in Jacksonville, Florida. You kind of get a sense then. And all of these images are in the book. And the press was incredibly generous to let us have of 60 images. So you tell the story not just in the text, we have these wonderful photos that we were able to collect and other artifacts you'll be able to take a look at. But these are his father, George Sr., his mother, Minnie. You kind of get a sense of George as a very young boy and what the family is looking like. You got his brother John, right? You got his sister Elzada. And he was able to go to high school. And we don't think about how significant this is. Jacksonville had a high school, a black high school, right? And there were no more than a dozen black high schools throughout the entire South. So the ability to actually have the chance and opportunity to go to high school for George, was fortuitous. And he graduates from that high school and ends up at Morehouse College, right? And the rest of his life, as you know, he's a Morehouse man. Right? So there's no education more significant than the education in his mind, as well as the community that he was able to forge in college at Morehouse. Right? Now, incredible ambition. I was kind of wrestling with this with Ed as we're trying to write the book. How do we kind of really understand George Crockett's confidence, and I say this in positive sort of sense, and ambition, right? Because he's graduating from Morehouse, he wants to go to Harvard Law School, right? So you sort of see this trajectory. He knows he can do anything he wants. He knows if given the opportunity, he can accomplish whatever he puts his mind to. But then he got the sort of sticker shock of how expensive Harvard was, right? And then just the reality that his family, even the extended family, was going to be kicked in to let him enable to go to law school, couldn't afford that. But then he's reading, and he finds out about this wonderful gift from a man named Cook to the University of Michigan. And he starts focusing on the University of Michigan Law School, which was incredibly cheaper than some of the Ivy League schools, but still an excellent law school with an excellent reputation. Right? So he sets his sight on Ann Arbor, right after graduating from Morehouse. He's able to do that from extended support from an aunt who gives him kind of an allowance to let him do there, and then he has to work, right? And he works in a fraternity house in the dining room, right? But one of the things that enables him to do is have at least one good meal, right? And you have these letters coming out of the admissions office at the University of Michigan kind of admonishing this is a very serious school, and law school is very serious, and we don't think our students should work, right? Sort of telling him that he can't have a job because it's going to distract from his education, where the reality is if he's not working, he can't afford the tuition to go to school, right? But I kind of have this image of him showing up in Ann Arbor, right? With the Ann Arbor winters, and the coldness is not just metaphor, or it's not just real, it's metaphorical, right? Coming out of the warmth and collegiality of Morehouse into the kind of coldness of being the only African-American student to graduate from law school in 1934, right? That kind of strength that lets him survive that journey, and not only survive, but thrive and perform incredibly well in law school, right? So you get the picture here the law quad, if you can kind of sort of see the fainter images in the background, celebrating his graduation in 1934. He goes back to Florida to take the bar, right? And the bar was given in Jacksonville in the state Senate chambers, right? And there's no way in this Jim Crow era they're going to let a black man sit in the Senate chambers to take a bar. So they set a table outside in the hallway for George Crockett to be able to take the Florida bar. Right? And the sort of exchange later on in his life is he's choosing his battles, right? He's not going to fight that one because he needs a law degree, right? Once he gets a law degree, you can imagine the kind of justice that he can be striving for later as his life is progressing. Right? So he's sitting outside the Florida State Senate chamber, takes the bar, passes the bar, right? Spends a little bit of time practicing in Florida, and then decides that that's just too far south, right? And ends up moving to West Virginia, which is kind of the most north that you can get and still be in the kind of Jim Crow South, and sets up his practice in West Virginia, right? And sets up the first chapter of the NAACP. So you're starting to see the political consciousness and the civil rights consciousness emerging as he's starting his law practice. But then he switches parties, right, in a fairly public act. You sort of have these newspaper stories announcing his change from being Republican, right, to being Democratic. And then he supports the state or the U.S. Senate candidate from West Virginia in 1938. Right? That Senate candidate wins, right, and as in all political patronage, he promises George a job in Washington, D.C. Right? So George gets a job at the Department of Labor, right, and becomes the first black lawyer to be working at the Department of Labor. Succeeds again. I mean, he's successful everywhere he's going, but reaches a glass ceiling. Right? He's told that he's not going to get any more promotions at the U.S. Department of Labor because the next promotion would mean he'd be supervising white lawyers. Right? And they're not going to let a black man supervise white lawyers. Right? So what George says, I've had enough of the Department of Labor. Right? And moves laterally over to the fairly newly created Fair Employment Practices Commission, and becomes one of the first hearing officers during the Fair Employment Practices Commission. Right? One of the things that does is gets him to Detroit. Right? We used to have streetcars in Detroit. Some of our elders acknowledge that. And during 1943, there was a strike of the streetcar workers. Right? And George Crockett was up here being the investigatory officer looking at that strike, and fortuitously meets the president of the UAW on his train ride back to Washington, D.C. And out of that connection with the president, R.J. Reynolds Thomas of the UAW, gets an offer to come and work at the UAW and lead their efforts to fight discrimination inside of the union. So in 1943, he's back in Michigan, right? Shortly after the race riots, and I'm saying riots very consciously of 1943, and is starting his work as a lawyer now in Michigan, working at the UAW. Right? You sort of get the sense this is the only photo we were able to find of Crockett, right, at the UAW, sort of sitting there in his office. And a photo of him at the announcement of his new position, heading a new commission to fight discrimination inside of the union. And you start to see he has his own family starting. Right? So this is his wife, Ethelene Crockett, and people here are going to know that there's two famous Crocketts in Detroit. One George, the other his wife, Ethelene Crockett, and the three children that they had being raised then in Detroit. All right, anybody recognize this gentleman? Maurice Sugar. Right? So today you might know the Sugar Law Center. He was the general counsel of the UAW, right? Particularly during the sit-down strikes and the sort of formation and the sort of contractings that they're making them with the big three auto workers. But George Crockett called him his father in the law, right? Became an important mentor to George Crockett. And it was at the UAW that he meets not only Maurice Sugar, but Ernie Goodman. You're going to see Ernie Goodman's sort of name, and that friendship and that relationship lasted both of their entire lives. But we were talking about the UAW earlier. This is also the time where Walter Reuther is rising inside of the union. Right? And this is a time of tremendous sort of internal turmoil, not just in the UAW, but in the U.S., at the end of World War II, the beginning of the Cold War, a lot of the sort of Red Scare starting to emerge, and a lot of the purges are taking place inside of the UAW, led by Walter Reuther on his way to becoming the head of the UAW. And in the process, purges and throws out Maurice Sugar, throws out Ernie Goodman, and throws out George Crockett. Right? So he moves there, and by 1947, just 4 years after moving to Detroit to work at the UAW, Crockett is basically out on his ear. Right? And furthermore, Reuther is leading a boycott against their firm. Right? So they're not going to give any labor work. Right? So they're trying to survive after being purged out of the union and facing a boycott at the same time. So one of the things that happens is that as part of the Red Scare, the U.S. government arrested all 12 leaders of the United States Communist Party. That would be the equivalent of, arresting everybody that's on the Republican National Committee, right? Or arresting everybody that's on the Green Party, right? If you want kind of a little bit of a closer analogy, for criminal charges, right? And to be clear, it was not for what they did, it was for what they thought and what they taught. And so the sort of notion of the First Amendment being turned on its head and having no real meaning. But Maurice Sugar had connections, right, and was an advisor. A little bit backstory of Maurice Sugar could not practice in federal court because during World War I he was a conscientious objector and went to jail. And that got him disbarred from federal practice. He was able to regain state practice. So he was there as an advisor. And it was very important to the Communist Party to have an integrated defense team. Right? And sort of go back, and we'll come back in some of the stories later. The Communist Party was incredibly strong on black civil rights. Right? The Scarborough Boys, right, being represented initially by the Communist Party, and a number of other black folks in controversial cases that the NAACP wouldn't touch. Right? The Communist Party was there, and the Civil Rights Congress was there, which was a Communist Front organization leading the charge. Right? So you have this interesting long-term relationship between advocates and real fighters for black civil rights, like George Crockett, and members of the Communist Party. So the first person that was on the integrated defense team was actually Charles Hamlet Houston. Charles Hamlet Houston, which would sort of raise eyebrows, was really the architect of the fight against segregation leading up to Brown versus Board of Education. Right? And for reasons that are not really clear from the record that we were able to look at, leaves the defense team. Right? And I think the best story you can tell it was for health reasons, because he dies prematurely at a fairly young age, just a few years later. Right? So they're sitting there, right? And Crockett, or being Maurice Sugar, is the advisor, right? And calls up George Crockett to ask him if he wants to join the defense team, right? In one of the biggest criminal trials of the last century, United States versus Dennis. Right? And Crockett was actually on a ladder painting his living room when he gets the call, right? And you sort of imagine that conversation. And he would always create lists, right? But what are the pros? What are the cons? And it's very clear, this is almost a death wish for a lawyer, right? To go and represent the Communist Party at the beginning of the Red Scare and the kind of McCarthy era. But Crockett was incredibly brave, right? And incredibly principled. Right? And for him, this case was about the First Amendment. Right? And people have the right to express their views, and you can't adopt an interpretation of the First Amendment that is really going to persecute people for what they think and what they say. Right? And furthermore, Crockett really believed that it was inappropriate for a lawyer to use their own personal judgments and beliefs about how this would affect them personally in deciding about representation. Right? So a combination of really courage and principle and trust and Sugar, I'd have to sort of say that notion that he wouldn't think that Sugar would ask him to do something either that he didn't think he was capable of doing or that he shouldn't be doing. Those sort of forces come into fruition and lead Crockett to say yes to that phone call and then become part of the team that's representing the 12 members of the Communist Party in the United States versus Dennis. And so this is a picture of the 5 lawyers, right? Crockett, the only black lawyer involved. And, this is not going to be a successful trial. And these are images, since you can't have cameras in the courtroom, these are actually images that were taken from Life magazine about the trial. Right? And it's very hard to actually get pictures of what's happening inside of the trial. But there's Judge Medina, who's a main character in the book and quite a piece of work himself. And like all federal judges, incredibly narcissistic and sort of power hungry and trying to use this case to catapult himself into position. This is a representation in Life magazine of the defense team, right? And again, they're not going to be flattering to these lawyers, right? They're going to try to make these lawyers look as silly and as incompetent as they can. And this is their portrayal of Crockett, right? That kind of notion that is not flattering. There's one point in the trial, actually, he is crying, right? He's sort of talking about the civil rights struggle and all of the abuses African Americans have been put up to. And way over here, right, is Maurice Sugar, right? Which is, again, kind of a low-key advising role. But you kind of get a sense, right? And all of the press was against the defendants, obviously, but was also of doing a real job on the defense lawyers, right? And taking them in an incredibly unflattering light. Crockett's closing argument is later going to be published as a pamphlet, right? It's freedom is everybody's job. And a lot of his role, sort of both legally and sort of politically in the trial, was looking at the relationship between the Communist Party and the civil rights movement, right? And racial issues of racial justice. So the majority of this is focusing on that set of issues about how the Communist Party have been defenders of civil rights at times when Republicans wouldn't, right? Or times when Democrats wouldn't. This is still a time when they were filibustering the anti-lynching laws, right? That were only passed a few years ago. And there's another part of not this closing argument, sort of colloquy, where you can imagine the FBI was all over the Communist Party. They could say where everyone was, what meetings they went to, what they said at the meeting, who else was at the meeting. I have all of these sort of absolutely detailed sort of records through their of investigations and their infiltrations. And then Crockett is saying, and yet nobody's ever been arrested for lynching. Right? There's never been an investigation. There's never been this sort of record, kind of contrasting the amount of resources and the priority they're putting into tracking down the members of the Communist Party at the same time. The FBI and the government, whether it's Republican or Democrat, are doing nothing, right, in the fight for racial justice and for civil rights. Right? So no big surprise, right? This is the jury foreman, who actually was a black woman. So it's interesting ways in which race is kind of integrated in. And that's in part no small amount because they were challenging the jury selection process for being racist. Right? And so after the judge denies that, they choose a jury that actually interesting is more integrated than it probably would have been, but for the challenges that were being made in the jury selection process. Anybody think that they were acquitted? Right? So nobody raising their hand on that. So everybody knew from the beginning that they were going to be convicted. Right? So that part is not the big surprise. But after Judge Medina hears the verdict, right, he looks at the defense team and says, I have some unfinished business. Right? So he dismisses the jury, right? And then he tells the defense team, you're all going to jail, right? And holds them in criminal contempt, right, for their zealous representation of their clients with absolutely no due process, right? No notice this is going to be happening, no impartial decision maker. The judge was abusive throughout the process. So now, after you've sort of put your career on suicide, right, acting out of principle, you're facing criminal charges. Right? You're facing jail time for doing what you thought was the right thing. And this is a pretty famous photo of the defense lawyers reporting to be taken off to jail. Right? So one of them is in shackles. The others are not yet. Right. And they were all held up, right, to do that perp walk, right? So this was all the photos getting the lawyers. And one of the articles in the Detroit paper talked about Crockett as the communist lawyer, right? And then they retracted and said, oh, we forgot the apostrophe S, the communist lawyer, not the communist lawyer. But again, that kind of turmoil internally, right? Because Crockett believed in law, right? Why somebody growing up in the Jim Crow South does is another interesting set of discussions and questions. So to have, and you'd expect it, abuse of law if you go to the South, right? That was just part and parcel of living in the South. But to have that kind of lack of a rule of law in his role as a lawyer, right, is something that just angered him, right? In ways that were interestingly different sort of anger the many of the abuses that he suffered at other parts of his life in terms of facing aspects of discrimination. All right, so lots happening, and so the book is trying to juggle a lot of things taking place very quickly in the early 1950s. Some of the more positive things that are happening. 1951, Crockett is part of the first founding of an interracial law firm. Right? So you've got Goodman, Crockett, Eden, and Robb, right, is the name of the firm. And in 1951, the creation of the nation's first integrated law partnership. Right? Crockett is one of the partners in that process, and as I said before, that friendship that he had with Ernie Goodman lasted their whole lives. So a lot of these stories of what was happening in the 1950s is really Crockett and Goodman working together. And you got to remember how serious the Red Scare was, how serious the McCarthy era period was, right? So you not only have the trial of the leading members of the Communist Party, there's going to be an arrest at state level of the 6 leading members of the Michigan State Communist Party called the Michigan Six. And Crockett and Goodman firm are going to be the only ones around that are going to be willing to represent those folks. There are people who are losing their citizenship because they were being charged of having lied in their naturalization processes and denying alleged membership of the Communist Party. So people who had lived here, they defended a state senator, former state senator Nowak, who was being forced into deportation proceedings and losing his citizenship. And then you had the hearings of the House Un-American Activities Committee, right, HUAC. And HUAC came to Detroit in 1952, right, and was taking on all sorts of people in the labor movement, right, as well as the civil rights movement. Right? So this is a wonderful photo of Coleman A. Young, right, who is being called in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee, and this is his lawyer, right, George Crockett. Right? Again, it was Crockett and Goodman were really the only lawyers in the state willing to take on representation like this. Right? You'll see the last picture that we're going to show is another picture of both of them much later in their careers with that kind of notion. Anybody know the story of Coleman Young's testimony? Right, so we had some folks back. He turned the process upside down, right, in just a hilarious way, where he really put the congressman on trial, right? And they recorded it. It was pressed into a record, right? So this became sort of a really hot commodity in black neighborhoods in Detroit, and was part of the growing lore surrounding Coleman Young. Right? So. At the end of the day, you don't stop the process, but you sort of have these small little victories that you can point to, and this was one of them in the way that Coleman A. Young just took control of that proceeding in an incredibly humorous way. What's that? And we're happy to get questions.
I think they just played that recording the last week on one of the either Ann Arbor or Detroit NPR station.
Yeah, you would probably get it on just Google. It's worth. It
was all about Coleman Young and his history here, and they talked about this. And well, I think they played that same recording.
Yeah, and in the book we have sort of the reproduction of the transcript, but you've got to hear it. So if you can get the audio portion, it's really priceless.
So it would be Coleman and Young in what date? 1950.
This is 1952. So House Un-American Activities of Committee testimony, 1952. Yeah. Legal processes are going forward. The lawyers are fighting the criminal contempt proceedings. Goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, and they lose. Right. So ironically, there were 2 hearing dates. On the second set of hearing dates, the morning that he's going to go represent people in front of these proceedings, gets the notice that he's going to jail. So this is a copy of the telegram on that day telling him to report to New York, where that photo that we looked at earlier was taken of the lawyers then doing their perp walk and ready to go to prison. And he spends 4 months in federal prison for representing the clients in the United States versus Dennis. And during this whole period, he's also facing disbarment. Right? So every one of the other lawyers, those other 4 lawyers, were ultimately disbarred in their home states. Right? In Michigan, and this is again part of Crockett's reputation, but also what a well-oiled machine that the sort of Goodman, Crockett sort of firm and allies as well as the strength of the Wolverine Bar Association and a lot of sort of back politicking. At the end of the day, there was a deal, which Crockett said no to at first, that if he apologized to Judge Medina, right, that he would face a reprimand and not disbarment, right, which was really not a bad deal. But Crockett had such legitimate pride, right, and knew that he was being mistreated, that he didn't do anything wrong, that it took all sorts of arm twisting and persuasion to get Crockett to agree to do that apology to Judge Medina. Right? But ultimately, this was the argument people were making. You're still a young man, right? You still have this amazing legal career in front of you, and don't throw it away. Right? So at the end of the day, he apologizes, he gets reprimanded, but he doesn't get disbarred. Another interesting just sort of historical picture, this is at the sort of period where he is of getting close, the appeals are coming to an end, he's about to go to jail, and he's interviewed an exclusive interview by Lorraine Hansberry. And this is kind of a much more stylish picture that was published with the interview of Lorraine Hansberry. The clarity is something that we wish we would have a little bit better on. The law firm, Goodman, Eden, and Robb, is growing, right? So in the 1950s is doing large amount of work on the Red Scare and the McCarthy era. And at the end of the 50s, you're sort of reading through some of the correspondence and some of the interviews with his law partners. George is just despondent, right? He's not excited about the practice of law. He's not motivated. He goes to his office frequently, just closes the door, which is not the sort of culture of the office, and is really just trying to find a different lane. Right? What is he going to do? And this is when the firm and the National Lawyers Guild, which Crockett and Goodman were incredibly connected to at leadership positions, start to pivot from the Red Scare into the civil rights movement. Right? So the National Lawyers Guild, largely the instigation of Crockett and Goodman, are starting to move towards civil rights work. Right? And one of the key things, this is part of Crockett's sort of continued sort of drum he keeps beating, there aren't any black lawyers in the South. And the handful that are often aren't even doing civil rights work. And there's not a whole lot of white civil rights lawyers in the South doing civil rights work. Right? And so the notion of the National Lawyers Guild is to say, we're a national organization, we're a National Bar Association. We can arrange to have lawyers from the North, black and white, right, go to the South and do the legal work for the civil rights movement. And critical, right? If you were arrested and went to jail, that could be a death sentence, right? Especially sort of some of the white folks that were down there that were being beat in prison. So the first thing you had to do is get them out of jail on bond or bail, right? But you need the lawyers to do that, right? The second thing you tried to do is get it removed from state court to federal court. Sort of a two-step dance. Get them out on bail so they're not facing the kind of abuse and torture in prison, and then move from state court to federal court. So we're doing very creative work on what lawyers call removal of cases. Right? But it also is energizing him, right, and sort of giving him, I think, a renewed set of purpose. They then became critical. They were doing sort of a series of legal trainings because the sort of formula of cross subsidies that kept the Goodman firm alive was that Eden was doing workman's comp, right, which is sort of steady work that produced revenue, right? And then Dean Robb was doing very innovative work on personal injury and torts, right? It was really sort of creating new law as it relates to torts of different kinds. And so they're producing the revenue while Goodman and Crockett are doing the civil rights work, right? And what they did is to try to take that model down to the South. So they held two different conventions to try to get the folks to say, well, can this work in the South? Right? We have that same kind of cross subsidy. And Dr. King spoke at the first event they had, and that's Dean Robb in the middle, is the law partner that you saw earlier in the photo. And I wish they had better photographers. They had a great sense of humor. Right? This is the second conference, so this is Ernie Goodman, this is George Crockett, this is the Confederate room. Right? So this is where their meeting was being held in the ballroom of I think it was the Hilton, in the Confederate room. You kind of just get their sense of humor of going down the first integrated legal meeting to be held in New Orleans, right? And are trying to get that model to be going forward. They became instrumental in 1964 Mississippi Summer, where they Guild had an office in Jackson, Mississippi, right? And who was heading that office? George Crockett. So George Crockett is down there heading the Guild efforts in 1964, and other lawyers from Michigan. Some of you know of Anna Diggs Taylor, right? Claudia Markman, right? Making the cover of Jet magazine, sort of as they're down in the South as women, right? Black women who are doing this work as well. And there's a kind of emotional encounter that Crockett is saying, sort of asked, were you scared? Right? And he talks about the first time he's going into prison to represent a client to try to get him out on bond. And the person has been beaten. So you see the scars and the sort of lacerations on his back. And he said, I went down there, I was scared. And then I was just angry. Right? And that kind of notion of that righteous anger carrying him forward through what was an incredibly frightening time. We all know the murder of Goodman, Cheney, and Schwimmer. What you don't know is that the lawyer that they called to find out if they could do a civil rights case was George Crockett. Right? So before they go into Philadelphia, Mississippi to investigate the church burning, they were getting advice from Crockett about what they would need in terms of evidence and testimony to make that case. Right? So you get that closeness of the Guild lawyers, of Crockett, of the other civil rights lawyers during that time. This is a picture of the door of their office. And he comes back to Detroit, right, sort of still on fire with this notion of doing different kinds of work, right? And fighting racism in the North in the same way that we're trying to fight racism in the South. Makes an unsuccessful run for the Common Council. Right? So in 1965, after he comes back to Detroit, this is the clerk's office trying to file for running. He's not successful in that political race. The next year, what he does is decides he's going to run for recorder's court. Right? And I just sort of love this. It says, I'm George Crockett for judge. Right? So 1966, right? Our elders in the room are going to remember we had a recorder's court and what recorder's court was. Right? Our younger folks really need to learn that. The criminal court for Detroit used to be coterminous with the boundaries of Detroit. Right? It was called recorder's court. So if you had a criminal offense, you would be tried in recorder's court by a recorder's court judge. What that meant then, especially as the demography is changing in the 1960s, is that to get elected, you had to win Detroit votes, not county votes. Right? The jury was a jury more likely to be of your peers because it would be a Detroit jury pool, not a county pool. Right? So just this notion of an institutionally calibrated court, right, that made justice not guaranteed, but potentially more likely. And then that gets destroyed in the 1990s, and there's a whole fight over recorder's court that we'll get to it in Crockett's story as well. But is running for recorder's court, right? But remember what he was doing back in United States versus Dennis, right? So what do you think the FBI is going to be doing when they hear that the lawyer who was representing the communists is now running to be a judge in Detroit? And there's actually memos from J. Edgar Hoover, right, targeting Crockett in this campaign. And this is one of the flyers that sort of a right-wing front group was circulating. Right? So why we must not elect George Crockett, very subtle hammer and sickles on either side, enemy sympathizer, enemy collaborator, and you have this whole instrumentality coming out from the right wing, right, and supported by the FBI trying to get Crockett not elected. Right?
What year is this?
This would be 1966. Right?
Before they started after the Black Panthers.
A lot of these things are starting to overlap because the Panthers are getting organized in Oakland the same year, right?
Okay.
But also kind of different tracks and slightly different motivations or why they're coming after Black nationalists versus why they're coming after Crockett as the sort of the tail ends of the Red Scare, right? But obviously these things are going to be overlapping as well, right? But who's going to attack him? That's on the right, right? So who's going to attack him on the left? The UAW. So the UAW is coming after him. They'd originally endorsed him, then they withdraw their endorsement. Right? And that bad blood between Walter Reuther and Crockett lasted all of Reuther's life, right? Who died at the end of the 1960s.
Why was there between him and Reuther? I don't understand.
Yeah, so two quick stories, right?
Okay.
One of the stories is Reuther was on the rise that was doing the purge, and Crockett was one of the people being purged. So when they're throwing out Sugar, they're throwing out Goodman, they're throwing out Crockett. But Ruther was in charge of the General Motors contract. And Crockett was in charge of fighting discrimination inside all of the union. Right? And Crockett was demanding that there be anti-discrimination provisions and was successful in getting them in the Ford contract, right, and in the Chrysler contract. Right? And Ruther promised him that it would be in the GM contract. Right? And then Ruther broke his word. Right? And Ruther agreed to a General Motors contract that did not have the anti-discrimination provision, and that sort of, Crockett was a man of principle. You don't lie to me and think I'm going to be okay with that.
So
right?
like most men, Ruther had no halo either.
No, I mean, people are complicated, as I always want to say, but we got to know the complications, right? Because the history that we receive from the winners, right, don't have the complications, right? And then we got to go back and kind of understand the nuances and that they made choices and not all their choices were supportive. So you had him being attacked on the right, right? He's being attacked on the left, right? But Black Detroiters knew Crockett, right? Black Detroiters liked Crockett, right? And this was also his election part of a signal to say white Democrats and white unions aren't going to tell us who to vote for, right? So Crockett's victory is also sort of the rumblings of a more independent, right? A voice in Black Detroit saying we're going to make our own decisions. We're not going to be told what to do, and he wins. Right? So he wins in 1966, right? You see him in his chambers. You see a gathering in his chambers kind of celebrating an older Marie Sugar, right? His law partners here gathering in his chambers as he's starting to become a judge in 1966. So the election was in 1966. He gets sworn in January 1967, and we all know what's going to happen 6 months from now. Right? So you have this kind of notion. He's certainly experienced as a lawyer. He's certainly experienced in fights, so it's not like that he's going to be there. But during the rebellion, as they were doing these mass arrests, the prosecutor was telling the Recorder's Court judges, right? I'm saying that the prosecutor was telling the Recorder's Court judges they had to post bonds of $10,000, right? Which is basically saying you're not getting out of jail. And almost every other judge did that, right? Crockett did not. It's sort of 6 months into a new role, fighting the establishment, saying that's collective guilt, right? That's not individualized assessments of people's risk, which is what you do in a bond hearing. And working with Claudia Markman, who is now at Neighborhood Legal Services, had a very innovative way where they were able to get assessments of everybody that was being brought in front of them, right? And Crockett did individualized justice in the midst of all of this sort of craziness and stuck to his guns. Right? And some reports and studies afterwards were really sort of lauding him and saying, you know, he's the one who was standing up for individual justice at a time when everybody else is going for collective guilt. Another important case in that sort of very early period, 1967, 1968, there was a person who committed a crime, right, but had a drug problem. It was really kind of that notion of the drugs driving the crime, right, and the need for the drugs driving the crime. And what Crockett did is rather than sending them to prison, was going to send them to rehabilitation. Right? And there was a huge backlash. Right? This is sort of setting the template of Crockett does something, right, and then there's sort of this huge outcry on the white community against it. And you sort of say, this judge here, bus ticket to rehabilitation center, and it says, try not to get any irresistible impulses en route. Right? And what happens? You have the white community coming after Crockett, the black community is defending Crockett. Right? So this is now showing in the Michigan Chronicle. We agree with Judge Crockett. It gives the rationale why rehabilitation and public health frame is more important. We haven't heard that recently. And then important groups are standing up for Crockett. Right? So the sort of notion of this tit for tat taking place, which is critical because his most important decision is going to come in 1969. This is the New Bethel Baptist Church, right? C.L. Franklin's church. They were hosting the Republic of New Africa. So in 1968, the Republic of New Africa is formed in Detroit, right? They're holding their first annual convention in the basement of the Republic of the New Bethel Church, right? And there's an altercation outside the building, right? And one police officer is killed in the altercation, another police officer is shot. Within minutes, literally, dozens and dozens of police officers are on the scene, right? With guns blazing. and they invade the church, right? And it's amazing nobody got killed. People were injured, but people were not killed, right? And then 2 years after, the rebellion was started by what? A mass arrest by the police. They arrest every man, woman, and child that is in that church, right? And the scene that's on the book cover is showing the people being detained in the basement of the church. And then they're going to be taken to the first police precinct. So, C.L. Franklin, the minister, right, civil rights leader, father of Aretha Franklin, Jimmy Del Rio, who was a state representative, first go to the courthouse, or not go to the police precinct and try to get a sense of what's going on and who's being arrested and what are you going to do, and are not getting any respect or any response. Right? So 5 a.m. on a Sunday morning, they're knocking on Judge Crockett's door. Right? And they're telling what's happening, and Crockett is going through his mind. First thing is saying, we're going to have another rebellion. Right? This is exactly how the last rebellion started. Real legitimate fears that there's going to be another rebellion. Within an hour and a half, he is down at the first precinct. Right? He's demanding to get a list of who was detained, and they don't have one. He is marching up to the police commissioner's office, right? And he demands space inside the police station to start holding habeas corpus proceedings. Right? And he starts to release anybody that the police don't have individualized evidence of guilt. Right? And the prosecutor comes in and tries to shut it all down, is ordering people not to be released, so the judge has just ordered them to be released. The judge holds the prosecutor in contempt, right? And reconvenes. We'll go back to my courthouse at 1 o'clock. Right? And in the afternoon, they're back in his courthouse. He proceeds to release anybody the police don't have evidence for. And you would think that the day after, black separatists kill a white police officer, that might be the headlines. No, right? All hell is breaking loose because a black judge is protecting the civil rights of black citizens. Right? And Crockett then becomes the sort of the center of the maelstrom. And the story is there's a huge backlash now against Crockett. But one of my favorite pictures in the book, this is him at the desk sergeant. Right? So this is George Crockett sort of looking them in the eye saying, I want the names of the people. Right? I want to see the police commissioner. You've got C.L. Frank, you've got Jimmy Del Rio on either side. That kind of that sort of look in his eye, that face, is he's there telling them we're going to hold court in the police station. I think is priceless. The police respond with huge pickets, right, and huge protests, right? And I think the signs even sort of say Crockett justice ? Release killers, prosecute prosecutors, give license to kill policemen. Right? And there's another photo where they're actually surrounding the entire recorder's court building. So white police officers are surrounding the courthouse. And what did we say before? White backlash, black defense. Right? So formed to protect Crockett was called the Black United Front. This was one of their protests. Right? So we see different sets of signs in support of Crockett. So you see this huge sort of outpouring of political support for Crockett. And just sort of as a sideline, bringing Coleman Young back in, I think it's fair to say, and I don't want to ever minimize Coleman Young's sort of agency, right, and political brilliance, but this black unity, right, which didn't exist before, really is part of the wave that's going to lead Coleman A. Young to be the first black man. Right? That kind of independent assertion of black political authority and power. Right? Crockett actually holds an important press conference in his courtroom, which again, judges don't do these things, right? It's kind of this notion of him breaking models and breaking rules. But one of the things I always loved is this is Frederick Douglass, right? So you sort of get that sense that this is a different kind of justice. You come into your courthouse, you know, right, you're going to be treated differently in Judge Crockett's courthouse than you are in other recorders' courts. All right, some of the political cartoons of the time are showing Judge Crockett or Judge Next Case and all these black militants coming out from under the bench. But again, the view of the black press is going to be very different. Right? So this is from the Afro-American. You can't break the law, officers, even to solve the worst of crimes. Right? And kind of admonishing the police officers is the black press story. So I'm going to fast forward. A lot of other great stuff. He retires from Recorder's Court in 1978. Ostensibly to spend more time with his wife, Ethelene. But his wife, Ethelene, had advanced cancer at that stage and didn't survive much longer. So Judge Crockett is going stir crazy, having nothing to do. Seat to Congress opens up with the scandal surrounding Charles Diggs. Crockett runs for Congress, right? Crockett wins. He's probably the most popular person other than Coleman Young in the city of Detroit at that time. Does a whole bunch of interesting things in the Reagan era, trying to fight the Reagan economic agenda. Probably the most important thing that he did was become a real leader in the anti-apartheid movement. Right? So he's passing resolutions for freeing Nelson Mandela, sees Nelson Mandela when he's there, and will end, I call this in the book, Real Black Power. So you've got Mayor Washington, you've got John Conyers, you've got Coleman Young, you've got Judge Crockett, kind of a new era of Black Power. And the last photo in the book kind of is a sort of more reflective combination of the relationship between Coleman A. Young and Judge Crockett. But I want to have your questions. So we're going to stop my talking. Any questions you want to ask?
Well, I'll help us get started.
Yes.
Great presentation. I'm really glad that you shared your time today and appreciated your work that you put into putting together the presentation and the book. So many questions asked. I'd like to, you to, if you will, take the context of one of your themes, which is, I guess the nicest way to say it is the level of discretion in the legal process. Going back to the judge putting the lawyers in jail, there's such a gap in this country in understanding the many things, right? But in particular, the times in which the Constitution has not been respected and the times in which the blind legal system has been anything but that. So can you kind of fast forward that the issues that were very obvious as you very well presented them today to, I'm sorry, Sandy, to the current political, cultural, perhaps, maybe more important views of so much of the country that is just not aware at best and resist at worst what I think you would call and I would call a genuine understanding of what's good and bad about America.
So first, thank you for coming out today, and thank you for a wonderful question. I'm going to start with that notion of discretion, right, and how powerful that is. Because Crockett knew that, right? He actually would argue that the most important position you can have is a district court judge. Right? This kind of notion of the Supreme Court, really understanding that you could do things in real time, right? And you get this sense that he was frustrated in Congress, right? 10 years is one of hundreds of people, you can't really do stuff, versus his ability when he saw something that he thought was right, he could do it. Right? But that's a man with principled courage. Right? That same discretion can be used in all sorts of incredibly abusive ways, and the dominant sort of narrative of our history is that it is used in those awful ways in terms of the role of race, which is why I started with the sort of quotes from the judge, which sadly you could say today. The sort of those quotes about there being no equal justice, that people are treated in two different ways, are sadly just as real today as they were when Crockett was making those pronouncements online. And one of our hopes is that this book can be made available to youth, right? Because the people who are fighting the front lines, people doing the Black Lives Matter protests, can learn from Crockett. Right? And indeed, that kind of voice has been eliminated. Right? Sort of one of the consequences of the Red Scare is that we no longer have a robust kind of debate over the last 50 years about different economic relationships, right? Different political relationships. And so you almost have to go back 50 years, 70 years to find strong voices that can speak to our needs that we're not hearing in a contemporary sort of setting. And so we really are hoping, and that's one of the reasons we use long quotes from the judge, that you hear from him, not us, these things. Now, why the sort of white mind resists it is another great perennial question. Right? And why, if you want to teach this in school, you're going to get a backlash, right? Because we can't teach these things in school. And I really think that's just part of at the key center. We talk about a dialectic between belief systems and institutions. It's the white American mind's self-defense mechanisms. Right? There's Charles Mills, who's a political philosopher, talks about white ignorance or the epistemology of ignorance. So what we don't know has to be manufactured and perpetuated by systems. And those systems resist change on a range of complicated layers. Conversely, what that means, if you want to get social change, you've got to be able to think about how you're going to be influencing the belief system, right? And I think you can say, not in absolute terms, but the first civil rights movement was focused too much on institutions and not enough on beliefs, right? And if we've learned anything in the last kind of 50 years, it's saying if we're not focusing equally and perhaps even more importantly on the of racist belief systems, we're not going to get change in the institutions. But I think we need stories, right? We need heroes. We need people to be truth tellers. And Crockett, throughout his whole life, was a truth teller. And that's, again, the thought that there hadn't been a biography is kind of shocking, right? And the significance of how important it is that the story is preserved now, so people can learn from him is, I think, incredibly significant. Thank you for your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Other thoughts or reflections, including just sharing what you thought of Judge Crockett, people who were living, in Detroit at the time as well.
I'm not a Detroiter. Can you tell me about Recorder's Court? Is it something significant in Detroit, the Recorder's Court?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly not the only example, but it's the case where you have a leading city in the state, and the justice system is defined around the city as opposed to the county. Right? And as demography is changing, that can be very significant for elections, for jury selection. And so when you get powerful judges, people try to kill the court. Right? So remember we talked about the backlash against Crockett in the New Bethel case? One of the things that happened was there were calls for his impeachment, right? And there was a process through the Judicial Tenure Committee. And the Judicial Tenure Committee, this is where rules don't matter for some people. The Judicial Tenure Committee said, no, we can't find that he did anything wrong. And they still gave the entire record to the Supreme Court. So, but you still might want to look at this, even though there's no process or no jurisdiction for that. And they didn't do that, but they did create a secret plan to eliminate Recorder's Court and to move Judge Crockett from the criminal bench to the civil bench. Right? Again, no due process, no sort of notion. So they were trying to use this as a pretext to get rid of Judge Crockett and get rid of Recorder's Court.
Who was they?
This was the Supreme Court of Michigan. At the time, or at least a majority of enough of the court who could produce that plan. And what you have to remember, or maybe what you have to realize, is that chief judges are huge in their administrative roles. Right? So it's not just sort of their role of making law or helping make law. They also have huge discretion in their administrative role about how culture is structured and run. So they were using that type of authority. But again, it's sort of secret process, right, to get rid of Judge Crockett. There was a huge backlash against that. Right, for reasons in defense of Crockett, but just on a wide range of other reasons, and it quickly died. But this notion of getting rid of Recorder's Court became an issue, right, for decades, and they finally did it in, I think, 94, 95. So now there is no more Recorder's Court, and that has huge implications on who's on the jury, right, who's the judge, and how easy or hard it is to get elected.
So it turned it into a circuit court system like it is everywhere else in the state.
Yeah, so it merges basically the county. Right, so Detroit is in Wayne County, so you have Wayne County Circuit Court. District. Yes.
So I don't really understand the whole court system, but basically what I'm hearing is there's a hierarchy of courts, and you start here, and then you can go to the next layer and the next layer, and that sort of thing. And so what you're saying is this, Detroit at this period had this new layer or special layer that was really focused on the city, which meant that your jurors were going to come from the city and you were going to deal with all the local issues.
Yeah, so it becomes a template to let the black power that is created in the city be reflected in the judiciary.
Right, okay. And then they could go up if they wanted.
Yeah, it could be appealed. But the district court is, as we were just saying, is so powerful. So that first impression, the ability to sort of create the facts, the ability to resolve cases. And appeals are more complicated. You take the record as given, you can only review the law.
So the first trial is really the important one because it lays out so much.
Can be very critical. Right?
If you get a trial.
Well, yeah. There's that. So the whole phenomenon of plea bargaining and other things that also are problematic.
Well, what was the gain from getting it from criminal to civil, or it was just a matter of they were just trying to move it?
Moving, but also he was using that authority to really make changes in criminal law.
Okay.
Right, and back to earlier points, criminal law is the tip of the spear for the state. Right? right?
Right.
So the most damage you can do is through the police, right, through the criminal justice system.
Oh, okay.
Right? And so if you have a strong black judge who's standing on principle, right? Other lawyers would tell me that if your client was guilty, he was a tough sentencer. He wasn't, he's not going to roll over, but he's going to give you fair process, right? And he's not going to let the process be usurped in ways that are going to be discriminatory.
I think Harvard did a study as to the biggest causes of poverty, and the biggest one they said is the white supremacist criminal justice system targeting blacks and putting them in prison and all these other things that lead to the poverty.
Yeah. No, they're completely combined, right? And that kind of role of criminal justice or injustice system being used
Yes.
as a point of oppression goes back to the very end of the Civil War.
And most white people don't know about it. We've got Biden speechwriters to put in there about the talk.
Yeah.
Most whites do not know that black families have to give their kids the talk. I never had to give my kids the talk.
No, and all of that is that question of what we still have to fight for today.
Mhm.
But so much of it is if you don't have fairness in the criminal justice system, if you don't have fairness in that pretrial process, which we want to acknowledge, and in that trial process, nothing's going to change. Right? And part of Crockett's advocacy was the significance of black judges. Right? And I was before that only black judges or other people who are oppressed by the system by extension are going to have the ability to realize the potential of the American system. Right? And he also was a leader. The National Bar Association is the national bar association for black lawyers. He was the first chair of the National Judicial Council when it was first created, again, of all black judges. So he spent a lot of his own time and energy advocating for trying to empower the role of black judges more generally, and not just of Michigan, but nationally.
And a heads up, the ACLU and others with them, including people like me, are reintroducing the bail reform criminal package of stuff into the Michigan legislature this time.
Yeah. So the fight's continuing, although
And I hope one of the things is that people get the phone call after they get arrested that, as one lawyer in North Carolina said, that's just television. Very few states have anything that require a phone call. I heard from a brown man, obviously with Mexican ancestry, who got arrested for failing to use his turn signal, pretext.
Yeah.
And his wife didn't know where he was for 3 days.
crazy.
So there's a lot of DWB, isn't just driving while black, but it's driving while brown. There's a lot of work to do.
Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Yes, yes, I was wondering, I remember when Porter's Court got, I guess you could say, disbanded in '94, and some people were saying that the only reason that happened was because of the Malice Green trial, that a lot of white people in the suburbs didn't like seeing these two white cops tried by a mostly black jury. I was wondering, was there anything the city could have done to prevent that, and why didn't they fight that?
Yeah.
I'm just curious.
I mean, there was a fight, and just again, the Malice Green case was presided over by George Crockett III. Right? So it was actually Judge Crockett's son who was the judge in the Malice Green case. There was a political battle, but part of it, again, is sort of saying who gets to make the choice, and that's a choice that is going to be guided by the Supreme Court in the sort of administrative function and backed by state legislation. So you're really saying part of this process is the broader disempowerment of the political voice of Detroit since Crockett's time. And it's much harder to get Detroit-specific legislation or legislation with benefit of cities more generally through. So part of that is also just that reflection of the shifting power dynamics in the state. But there was a fight, and indeed, Crockett, who had then been out of Congress, some of his last things were fighting the destruction of Recorder's Court. So I mean, that was something that he spent his whole life on. One more?
One more.
All right.
Peter, can you give us a little history of this Recorder's Court? I mean, when did it start and who started it?
Yeah, and that I'd say I can't be the voice for that one. I've actually tried to look for histories, because I want to learn that, answer that question. And I always, you don't know what you don't know. So there could be great histories of Recorder's Court, but I've not yet been able to find it. But I think that's, I always try to ground in history, so I think that's the exact right question. But I always tell people what I do know and what I don't know. I don't have an answer to
Glenn had a question.
Okay. We'll go here first. We haven't had a question yet.
I would, I haven't read the book. I would like to see Ernie Goodman get more recognition and credit for bringing Crockett and Millender into their law firm, the first integrated law firm in the United States.
Yep.
Ernie behind Coleman, this was a tight coalition with Crockett and all of them. But anyway, that's another story.
Well, we need to do an oral history.
Yeah, I met Ernie, he took care of the trial for Black Panther. We had Elliott Hall. They came and asked me, do you need help? Yes. And that's where I met Ernie and all of these wonderful people.
No. First, I will say that there is a good biography of Ernie Goodman, The Color of Law, Wayne State Press. So at least in terms of history, that story is there. But making it real and making it alive and making it in people's minds really needs a constant struggle.
And off the subject, but on the subject, I hope the people will get behind and take Ben Carson's name off of that school.
Yes,
For his
Amen.
wife.
Yeah.
I am a retired registered nurse who worked at the old Detroit General. I'm in my 97th year. But we had 2 black female doctors, Crockett and Marjorie Peoples. That was it. Most doctors couldn't get, they had to work in the few black hospitals. So that might be something you want to explore. But I think it'd be good if we can put his wife's name back on that school.
I love that idea. Thank you for your years of service.
I just want to say the recording of Coleman Young was in a program on WUOM. It was on Friday, and it's called Stateside.
Okay.
So you can go on the website and listen to it. It's on MichiganRadio.com, and then look up Friday's program for Stateside.
Thank you for sharing that.
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone, for coming out to Detroit Public Library today. A Source Booksellers is here, so if you want to buy a copy of the book, they're right behind us there. And Ms. Allison will be glad to sell you a copy of the book. And Professor Hammer, would you mind signing a copy if folks want to? Okay, so thanks again, and hopefully, I know we're having some in-person programs in April, so I hope to see some of you there. And thank you so much. Have a good evening.
It's called MichiganRadio.org, but WUOM is the station, MichiganRadio.org. It's called State.